Okay, so we're going to get the panel started. So I will introduce the moderator and then he can introduce the panelists. So our moderator today is Phil Daian from Flashbots, and the topic of the panel is Geographic Decentralization.
Sounds good. Yes. Hi, everyone. I am Phil Daian. Hopefully, you are all as tired as I am. So we have a bunch of very fun, spicy questions today about something I think is very important, geographic decentralization, and a few really impressive panelists. We have John, Pranav, and Quintus here with us today, and I'm going to let them introduce their own work because they probably know more about it than I do. So yeah, maybe we can go down the line, and if everyone takes a minute to just say who they are, what they're working on, and maybe if they want something about geo decentralization that's relevant to their work. You want to go first, John?
Sure. So hi, everyone. I'm John, one of the engineers at Celestia Labs. We're building Celestia, which is blockchain, I guess you could say. It is a blockchain that specializes in data availability. Therefore, it essentially optimizes and only does one particular task that blockchains do. So it moves execution up into higher layers, only does data availability, and therefore it can be maximally efficient and therefore maximally performant with the highest throughput, lowest latency, what have you, and verifiability because it focuses only on this one task of blockchains. So that's basically Celestia in a nutshell.
Hey, I'm Pranav. I'm a researcher at A16Z. Kind of broadly work on mechanism design, game theory type problems, lots of work on transaction fee mechanisms, MEV, all that type of stuff. So yeah, anything basically infrastructure related and game theory related, I try to think about.
I'm Quintus. I work at Flashbots Research, and I have been doing two things related to geographic decentralization. One is trying to get other people to do research on geographic decentralization, and so I'm aware of those conversations. And the other is working on sort of improving trusted hardware or secure hardware, getting better TEs, which I would argue is a technology that promotes geographic decentralization.
Oh, yo. Oh, that was so good. All right. Let me write that down to sidebar that. But first, I wanna do a context setting. So let's set the scene. Many people have many different definitions of decentralization, right? It's this kind of abstract kind of hopium we have in crypto that resists all science and definition. So I'm curious what you all think about when you think about geographic decentralization. What is your favorite definition? I'm going to try an anarchy session here where I'll just let whoever wants to speak grab the mic and then call on whoever hasn't spoken because I think I want to hear from everyone.
I can take a stab. Yeah, so I don't have a great formal definition, but like in some sense, you can think of like we have the world where information comes out of in different spots, and then we have nodes who are located in spots in the world. And so in some very loose sense, if the distance, like, I don't know, like average pairwise distance or like, distance between 2/3 of the nodes or something like this is very small, you're not very geographically centralized. If that distance is like quite big in proportion to how big the world is, then you look better. But I don't have a great one-line answer.
Sure. So I want to preface this with that I would not try to define geographic decentralization or geo-decentralization, just like I wouldn't try to say that, or claim that I'm providing a definition of decentralization, because that's just contributing to the problem where everyone has a different definition. But I would say my opinion. So my opinion is that geographic decentralization is a metric that has a few parameters. One of them would be physical distance between the various nodes in the network, basically what Pranav said. And the other one would be some metric around distributedness of various jurisdictions. Because, the USA, for example, this country is quite large physically, substantially larger than, I don't know, let's say France. So just because you have, one node on the West Coast and one node on the East Coast, is that really more geographically decentralized than if you have a node in Paris and a node in Berlin, right? The node in Paris and Berlin are closer together, but they're in two different jurisdictions. So you kind of have, in my opinion, when dealing with this, you have to take both the physical distance and also the jurisdictional distance, if you want to call that, into account.
Yeah, I would mostly agree with that. Only reframing I might add onto that is one that there are many dimensions of diversity which we look for because we rely on diversity for the sort of neutrality properties that we're interested in, and geography is one dimension, and there are other ones like just entities participating and their views on what should be included, etc. But also, I think in these discussions we tend to look at like sort of like static definitions, where we say, oh, is this network geographically decentralized today? And that's an interesting question, but probably a more interesting one is like, is a protocol designed to promote decentralization? How does it tend over time? And we can ask this about markets in general. Like if we have some market that we use to select validators or whatever, does this tend to monopoly? Can we design this market so that it somehow involves more actors over time?
Super interesting. By the way, let me disclaim for the audience that I have, as many of you know, very strong opinions on many of these things that I'll be keeping to myself today. So we're going to be neutrally moderating. How fun. All right. All right. So yeah, Tina's booing me. That's fine. She does that a lot. Yeah. So yeah, that's a perfect segue, I think, Quintus. One thing you just said and that we've kind of covered broadly is like there's many different angles to slice this. There's also this economic piece, this jurisdictional piece. There's also a distance piece. So one question, if we have all of these kind of elements of diversity that we want in our system, then why are we having this panel in San Francisco? That is the first question that I wrote down. But maybe on a more serious note, like, how do we think about also where these systems actually get built and like the power in crypto? And does that relate to these kind of technical definitions we're thinking about? And what can we as people sitting in SF actually do about this? It's a hard question.
So this thing on?
It looks on now.
Testing. Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay, now
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
on. Yeah. So, well, first of all, to answer your first question is, I don't know, you're the organizer, so you tell us why it's in San Francisco. But jokes aside, I think this, to kind of be politically correct, but also talk about the politics, is that talking about this kind of stuff, let's say a year ago in San Francisco, maybe you could do it, but maybe there'll be fewer participants that could participate in this kind of thing. The regulatory climate has changed with the new, with the new president and the new regulations and stuff. For better or for worse, that's neither here nor there. But it has changed, and this is one of the reasons that you potentially want geographic decentralization across jurisdictions, is because how different jurisdictions deal with cryptocurrencies, decentralized assets, and things that aren't even cryptocurrencies, AI, for example, right? How they deal with these things changes over time, and while some jurisdiction may be favorable today, 4 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, it may not be favorable. It may be very unfavorable. So one of the reasons that is an SF today potentially is that there's a more favorable regulatory climate for cryptocurrencies today, which is why we've seen a lot more American presence and US-based presence from various crypto projects, but that may not be the case 10 years from now. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, that was a great answer. I'm curious. So Pranav, I'm going to kind of put this on you, even though I don't know if you have anything to do with it. I feel like I've been seeing on Twitter out of A16Z recently, like things vaguely of the form, like we need to onshore crypto. Is that resonating with you
Can I
at
stop
all?
Nub's answer for you? This is not financial or legal
Yeah,
advice.
this is not financial, legal, regulatory, or life advice. Yes.
Yeah. So not representing A16Z's views here. Yeah, so personally, yeah, not involved in the whole mess of a legal world that people on our team are working on. Yeah, I mean, I think my personal opinion on this stuff is that I think some of that is more saying like we want less sketchy like Cayman entity stuff, less so like pure American business.
Flashbots Ltd is a Cayman entity. Sorry, continue.
So part of that message is like trying to create favorable environments for companies and whatnot. But yeah, I think there's interesting, like on the point of geographic decentralization of like, there's kind of two axes I think that are kind of being brought up. And one is the more like making sure the systems are robust, kind of like the long tail events of like very powerful state type entities, kind of trying to mess with these systems, and then the other end being like how can we create better like an equal playing field for people around the world and like operating on chain, right? So if like all the infra is located in the US, then a team from Asia either has to move to the US or set up servers in the US, and they just will have a worse experience with their infra locally, which I think seems bad. And so personally, I'm interested in kind of looking. I think the former question is extremely important, but is very hard to like theoretically analyze and model. But yeah, so I'm personally more interested, just for the sake of what feels tangible today, of looking at the second half of that question of saying like, how can we just get incentivize having robust infrastructure and like the same types of latency everywhere in the world, or like an equal playing field of latency, right? So that your confirmation time is, say, a second in Japan and it's a second in New York. It's not 0 in New York and a second in Japan. And so I think there's a hope to building those types of systems.
Nice. That was a great segue. So I know, Quintus, we've also talked about recently this kind of dichotomy or maybe categorization of, I guess, robustness and fairness, maybe one very loaded way to bucket these things. Curious if you have any thoughts to riff on there.
No, that's I think it's a good way of separating things. That those, I think this, the one property that you can think of it as censorship resistance. People say like, oh, I want a node in Costa Rica because if some government is censoring me, probably the Costa Rican government isn't censoring me, and I can get on chain. And there's another desire to have some proportional economic activity happening in Costa Rica. I think maybe to ask a question, I think when you talk about involving different geographies, you often hear this idea that says, well, why don't we have a per geography piece of infrastructure, right? We have like a DA layer in this continent, a DA layer in that continent, DA layer in that continent, and then each continent can be served by its local DA layer or its local whatever crypto infrastructure, and then maybe we'll have a bridge that connects those. And I think that does make sense to some degree, and a lot of the systems we're talking about sort of look like that. But at the same time, having like infrastructure that's specific to geographies with no connection between them also doesn't really meet the goals we are setting for ourselves of like bridging these trust boundaries between geographies. And one thing I would love to figure out maybe in this panel, maybe over the next couple of years, is sort of what are the trade-offs between those different kinds of designs, and what settings does one approach or another make sense, or even is even feasible English.
That makes sense. Would you say that's kind of the relationship between like locally gated systems and like maybe worldwide or geo-distributed systems?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable way of summarizing it.
All right, cool. I wanna pop the stack back to the beginning when we had a little bit of a disagreement between Quintus and John about TEEs. So curious, why were you skeptical, John? And then we can open it up to the panelists' comments.
Wait, trying to remember what I was disagreeing about. I think I was disagreeing that you said TEs help geographic decentralization. Was that
That's
it?
the claim. Yeah. Let's debate that claim now.
Wait, no, I feel like you're supposed to back up the claim.
I can go. So I think there's at least two arguments that I'll make, and if I'm creative, I'll think of more. But one argument is not specific to geographic decentralization, but just decentralization in general. So if you look at we had a talk about snitching and proving collusion in MPC. And one problem we have with MPC is like we probably don't want to have a static committee for too long. It's easier to collude in that setting. And I think most of the snitching stuff can be circumvented by colluding in a TE and these kind of things. And if we have this problem of selecting committees and we need to rotate them often, then we have this high overhead of selecting reputable actors. And if you're in one geography, it's more likely that you don't trust actors in other geographies. And using a security model that protects against, or like a security primitive that protects against these kind of collusive threats, makes it much easier to distribute these kind of trusted roles. So that's a point more generally about decentralization, and then one more specifically about geographic decentralization. And this is really Phil's point, and so I'll sort of make the argument at a high level, and then if you challenge me, I'll make him defend it. But it's that certain forms of security schemes require a lot of communication between nodes, like interactive NPCs, another the same example I'll give. And if you have many rounds of communication between nodes, with a bound on how fast you want to do something or an incentive to do something fast, you have a greater incentive to co-locate. But with TEEs, the security doesn't come from communication so much. And so, yes, maybe you give up some other security properties, but reducing the number of rounds of communication reduces the incentive to co-locate.
To clarify, you're saying because you use a different protocol that just happens to require less communication?
Do you want to give your signing example?
Right. So yeah. So if we want to collaborate on, let's say, each using like a key to compute some sum of like a secret input that we each have without revealing any of the component inputs, right? Sum is a bad example because you can kind of recover it trivially, but let's say it's like a three-party computation. Then if you want to do it with like, let's say like a garbled circuit MPC, like just fundamentally the way the protocol is constructed, you will require like a certain amount of kind of interactive communication. Like we will have to like decrypt like one gate and then like send the data and then kind of proceed in like rounds to decrypt the entire circuit. Because that's like where the hiding property comes from. It comes from the fact that like we're kind of going back and forth and there's some secrets and some entropy within all that. So there are like a wide class of protocols, I would say, where TEE kind of lets you eliminate that and do things kind of magically, which shouldn't be secure, but are. And so in that case, if it's okay to use a TEE, maybe you want to.
I'm convinced.
Okay, great. I was going to ask Pranav to pick a winner, but that didn't end up working out the way I expected it to.
Well, no, I mean, like it's very reasonable, right? Like a lot of what we're talking about, geographic decentralization is, co-location on one side versus spreading out geographically on the other side. And, the speed of light is finite, so of course, if you're dealing with something with a lot of communication overhead, then you want to reduce the total latency because otherwise you're just spending a bunch of time just moving light around, basically. So it's a completely reasonable explanation. I have no objection.
Nice, nice. Pranav, any thoughts on TEEs, light speed, or
yeah,
anything?
I think in general, it seems like T's basically never hurt unless you use them incorrectly. And so I think as long as you like know the trust model you're working with, okay, maybe not, but at least for like a decent amount of applications, or at least for geographic centralization, I don't imagine that it hurts. So yeah, I generally buy the agreement or the argument that like for protocols or card communication, if you can reduce that, they're helpful. Yeah.
I'm just gonna add. This is a completely random question, mostly for Quintus, which is, why don't you just build an open source TE?
We're doing. It's a challenging problem, a coordination issue, but we're working on it, and I think we will do that in the next couple of years. Hell yeah.
I want to see it.
Yeah. Happy to share. Yeah.
So okay, so we've talked about like a few things here, like $1 trillion cabal. Wow, I missed that. Sorry, it took me a second to process it. Hopefully this is not recorded. All right. So yeah, we've talked about kind of many properties here. It's like the communication, but also the distance between nodes and like the distribution into jurisdictions. When we have a new protocol proposal, like let's say MCL, or on the Ethereum side, like maybe there's a lot of noise now around reducing slot times or including inclusion lists or some other protocol change. How do we evaluate these things and weigh them? And I guess from all your perspectives as like operators in this space, like what is the biggest thing we're missing? Is it like a science? Is it data? Or what do you think, I guess?
I can give a very quick answer. I think that one challenge we have is that we want to simulate some of these changes, like a shorter slot time. And one thing that simulations miss is they miss incentives, right? They miss real world incentives. So you can replicate a network where all the nodes behave in the way you want them to, but probably, there are going to be different incentives. Maybe you want to release a block late, and there's going to be some like trade-off curve, and you might want to release it very late if there's high volatility. And factoring that into simulations, especially for like the engineers doing it, is challenging.
Yeah, I mean, I think one hard thing is like markets are always just so hard to predict and like know it'll happen. And especially, blockchains are always an interesting science in that you have app layer incentives and protocol layer incentives. And it's very hard to control the magnitude of the two and how they relate to each other. And so, things like shorter slot times or changing the consensus protocol. I think there's actually some arguments of like shorter slot times can like change the market structure so that like new types of applications can be developed on these things, which maybe kind of elicits more value for more parts of the world. So then maybe then the incentives actually, even if the protocol layer incentives are pushing you that, okay, now I need more centralized, or maybe my operating requirements are higher, so I have to leave certain places. But actually maybe on the other side, on the app layer, maybe there is more demand for more places. And so people actually do spin up new nodes in new places. And so we can do all the modeling we want. It's always really hard to see exactly things play out. I mean, I think econ is really good at giving us the directional way things will move, of saying, hey, yeah, well, like obviously if app layer rewards go up from Asia because like some protocol change makes certain applications viable there, then that seems good. But it's a constantly evolving fight to figure out how everything interplays and finding the right design.
Sure. I can add 2 points. I can expand both on Quintus and Pranav's points. So one of them, Quintus talked about simulations. So the third rule of engineering that I learned while I was in university is to find the answer, you must know the answer, which unfortunately applies to simulations, which is that it's pretty hard to simulate things unless you know what you're simulating. But of course, if you know all the incentives that you have to simulate, then, well, you just know all the incentives in the first place. And do you need to simulate it? Maybe, but also you know all the incentives. On the other hand, if you don't know all the incentives, then is your simulation worth much? So it's a very tricky problem indeed. So to expand on Pranav's point, I think it's actually a very good point that there are certain classes of applications that can't be built with certain latencies, for example. Right? Let's say you have 12-second slot time like Ethereum. Maybe you find it hard to build perp stacks. That's a club. Like Hyperliquid, right? So the Hyperliquid maybe chooses a different point in the trade-off space, but it enables an application that isn't quite a centralized exchange, arguably isn't quite a decentralized exchange, but certainly is different than something like Binance that you simply couldn't build on Ethereum. And if is the world better because that app exists versus if it didn't exist at all? Potentially, yes. So this might be an argument not for maximizing decentralization or geographic decentralization, but rather allowing different applications and different consensus protocols and different blockchains to flourish that take different points in the trade-off space because that allows applications that otherwise users straight up wouldn't have access to. And then finding a way to aggregate and secure over these different protocols instead of trying to make one thing that is the best at everything, because arguably you can't.
Yeah, no, I think we've gotten to kind of an interesting place here, which is like what I'm hearing is that it's very context dependent and kind of nuanced, and you need to almost take it on a case by case basis. Would the panel agree with that so far? And very hard to measure probably is another aspect.
Well, yeah, I mean, the first things first is we need a metric, but good luck agreeing on a metric.
Maybe we need many metrics, and then we can argue about them. And one school of researchers can optimize for one, another for another, and some of it will be completely academic, but there might be something useful that comes from it.
Cool. One more question I have is how do you fit privacy tech into this? So I think MCL was like one example of this, where you have this kind of blinding property used, and maybe there are other possibilities with TEs. So how do you all think about kind of all these new privacy technologies? And like, is there anything that's super promising from a geo-decentralized point of view, at least in today's context of the kind of systems and regulation we have.
I mean, I think there's a distinction between privacy, like during block building, and like long-term privacy, right? So for things like peer-to-peer payments that you might want to be private, like actually like forever, and not just when you're making the block. I think the types of systems you can make there look pretty different than the types of systems that are just privacy during block production, right? So like, for things like peer-to-peer payments, you probably don't care about like actually like 50 millisecond latency, like probably like, I don't know, 500 milliseconds or seconds, fine. And so like the incentives driving you to certain equilibrium in one case don't apply in the other. And so I think there's definitely things to explore there. I mean, yeah, I think in the lens of like, can we get privacy during block creation time, which I think of as more of a market structure choice that enables certain apps that otherwise like couldn't exist. I think that's super feasible. Yeah, like, the T stuff definitely makes a lot of sense there. I think the hiding erasure code stuff I was talking about makes sense there. There's encrypted mempool type stuff that has a different sort of the trade-off space. And so, yeah, I think the privacy, at least during block creation, is super compatible with still being geographically centralized. And then, yeah.
I can't remember who, but a very smart person remarked to me recently that potentially we've passed the peak of maximal decentralization. I think it was in Bitcoin. I have a bad memory, so maybe I'm remembering the protocols and things wrong. But like 2021, we have lots of hash rate in China. And then it gets banned, and all the miners leave China's. If you view the world as having like two poles of power, that's a very important loss of diversity in the network. And if we had better privacy at the network layer, at the level of the participants, then you'd probably see deeper penetration into a wider set of geographies. Yeah.
I'm gonna make a hot take related to what you said at the end there, which is that my hot take is that I'm unconvinced that on-chain privacy is viable long term, and protocols that rely on it, such as MCL. Sorry, Pranav. There was a presentation at SBC actually on this topic about de-anonymizing the Ethereum validators. And basically, they just had the TLDR, to just summarize it, and someone correct me if I'm butchering this, but they just put some validators around, watched the attestations that other physical nodes sent, used some heuristics and stuff, and basically figured out with fairly high degree of confidence which validator corresponded to which physical IP address. This is not like an inherently new idea. I was talking about these kind of attacks with Dankrat like half a decade ago. He was unconvinced at the time that this was possible. It turns out it is. Also, this is not my idea. I heard it from someone else at the time. Just so you don't think I'm trying to take credit here. But you can do things like this to de-anonymize people at the peer-to-peer layer. So even if you fully encrypt or fully ZK or whatever, what happens on-chain, there's nothing stopping adversaries from watching what happens off-chain. And it's very hard to hide your IP address because you need to connect to the internet from somewhere. And my hot take is that I'm unconvinced that, especially if we move towards an ever-increasing surveillance state where privacy is actually needed. In other words, when we need privacy versus when we don't need it. When we need privacy, if we're in a surveillance state, it's very likely and very possible that everyone's IP address is going to get watched, and everyone's going to know, or at least the actors that may want to censor will know who is transacting. Even if you do all the ZK and all the math in the world and there's no backdoor, they'll still know who is sending transactions because they can just watch the physical bits move around on the internet pipes. So that's my hot take. Hopefully it's not true, but my hot take is that we'll see stuff moving in this direction. And crossing my fingers we don't, but it might.
Isn't the action implied, the required action from that fear that we should increase anonymity sets as much as possible to normalize? Okay, so for example, you want to hide that you're an Ethereum validator, right? If we have some specific encryption, whatever hiding scheme that is only used for Ethereum, then you can tell if someone is using that by monitoring their traffic. But if you have a general scheme that people just use to like browse the internet and use Ethereum and whatever, and that is the status quo, then it's much harder to identify people who are doing the bad things. Right?
Yeah, that's a possible solution, but it means that if we want to resolve this, we need to look for solutions elsewhere and not just ZK encrypt on-chain traffic, for example. We need to think of more creative solutions that, like you said, maybe that's one solution.
Decentralize outside of Ethereum. Yeah.
Any thoughts on privacy, Pranav? You got two mics. Yes, the opposite of privacy. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, on this type of privacy, I haven't thought about it too much. I definitely see, yeah, there's like basically whatever cryptographic model you have always, there's like side channel attacks is basically what you're getting at, which definitely makes sense. I mean, I think this is less of a concern for like the block production time privacy. Like, I don't think of this type of privacy as being stuff that like I think of that as being much more economic in the sense of, oh, I don't want people to see my bids. Like, I don't want people to know exactly how much I'm bidding like at the second, but in a second I'm fine with that being revealed because the auction's over. And so at least privacy at block production time that only lasts a second or half a second or even less than that, I think that's still fully compatible with everything else.
Cool. That makes sense. I would love to take some questions from the audience if we have a minute for one or two. And if not, I have a closing question. I think we're almost out of time, right? Yeah, cool. Anyone have any spicy questions?
We have a de-anonymize over there, by the way. We're talking about your work earlier, Leopold.
Advice or plans on how to still capture that traffic?
Maybe you should repeat the question just for recording.
So the question was that basically users and chains are moving towards kind of this lower latency paradigm driven by things like demand for high frequency trading and other use cases that just require this lower latency to exist. And to the extent that this is in like tension with geographic decentralization, like running things over like a world scale network is slower. How do we think about that? Or is there like any advice for managing that tension?
Yeah, I can start maybe. So I think there's one interesting thing. Then this is kind of like the Solana viewpoint of like if one of the end games is let's actually build a chain that hosts like the world's finance. So it's like one interesting point is that execution can still be extremely fast, even with a very like globally centralized network, right? So the only thing geo-decentralization forces you is it says, okay, there's like a minimum, at least like couple delta latency to confirmation of transactions, right? And so what that means is when you submit a transaction, it will only be executed kind of at earliest like 200 to 400 milliseconds later, and then a consensus protocol you run that runs around the world. And now it's not obvious this is like inherently unworkable for TradFi, right? So you can still have that like the tick rate of the blockchain is going at say every 10 milliseconds, 20 milliseconds. It's just extremely pipelined, where kind of the transactions that are currently being executed were queued up 200 milliseconds ago somewhere around the world. And so I think one interesting thing is this is actually just like net new like market structure that doesn't exist in TradFi. Like there is no sense in which like a Asian exchange is on the same server as a like American exchange. And so I mean one of my hopes is that like actually this new market structure can actually like enable new types of applications and activity where maybe like this slightly different model of like a like I don't know if it's inherent that like you need finance to move at a rate of like sub 200 milliseconds to like actually be extremely productive. And so if there's apps that benefit from being on the shared state that still get the like instantaneous execution, but just delayed by this fixed amount, I think we could still live in the world that's decentralized with those properties.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's interesting that you mention a tick rate with pipelining, because that sounds isomorphic to a live blockchain with a finality gadget, which is essentially what Dev, the lead dev, no pun intended, of Osmosis has proposed with dev sharding. So dev sharding is essentially a hierarchical sharding scheme where you can have small committees that can be geographically co-located, and then they produce a bunch of blocks potentially extremely quickly, and then you have a larger globally distributed finality gadget, if you want to call it that, that attests over attestations from the committee or blocks produced by the committee, which sounds like an isomorphism of basically what you're saying, which is you have a very fast tick rate and then you pipeline things, therefore you have a finality gadget that operates over the very fast blocks. So it sounds like, and from what I've seen, there's a lot of similarities in things like dev sharding, multiple concurrent leaders, what you're describing here, roll-ups and all this other stuff. There's a lot of like convergent evolution where they're all kind of converging on something, a solution that has a huge amount of overlap, potentially though with different terminologies because we're approaching it from different angles.
Yeah, so I think it's so that's close. It's a bit different from what I was describing in the sense of, so yeah, I think that design makes a lot of sense. Of you have just different geographic areas that are producing at their own rate, and then there's some shared settlement across them. In the MCL version of this, it would be that like like the Tokyo and New York proposer make their blocks at the same time, and then they make another block 20 milliseconds or 40 milliseconds later before the previous block has like gone through that whole pipeline. And so at execution time, you're executing the batch of transactions from everywhere in the world at the same time, which is, I think not quite the same, but definitely I think it's a different point in the same trade-off space. But yeah, there's definitely, I think, tons of designs here that will be interesting to see how they all play out.
I kind of buy the convergence because I hear what you're saying, but in some ways, you don't have to consider the execution as happening at like finality time from like the global gadget. You could say like, oh, hey, my regional chain like confirmed it. Maybe it's like good enough for this use case. So yeah,
and there's a trade-off curve then where if uncertainty is expensive for you and if uncertainty is unpleasant, then you want to use a local system and you don't tolerate the like overhead or the latency of being interoperable. And if you benefit a lot from the shared state interoperability, then you take on the uncertainty of having to wait for the global thing to come to consensus. And that's like, I agree what all of these systems are tending towards in some janky way or another.
But it also means it was very exciting because we're going to see, I think, these systems evolve and be deployed over time, and not just be theory, which is nice because all the blockchains to date have just been single shared states and single global consensus, and that's it. So now we're going to see systems that pop up like this is going to be Cambrian explosion, and it's going to be very exciting.
Maybe just one thing to add here is I think we're very critical of so like you can imagine some system deploying 4 validators in the same country, and we all say, oh, why don't you just run a single server? And from this global decentralization perspective, that makes sense. But if we're thinking about it in this more hierarchical setting, from the perspective of the people in that country who maybe have a different relationship with the government, that still is a meaningful kind of decentralization. And maybe our critiques of systems should be more nuanced as well if we want to encourage this kind of hierarchical system.
Yeah, like for example, just as a concrete example, so that's not just purely theoretical. Is that, let's take Hyperliquid. Again, nothing against Hyperliquid, just as an example. They're based in Japan. They run their 5 validators that have 99.9% of the voting power and all ran by the Hyperliquid Foundation, all out of Japan. It's great.
Closed source.
Closed source, yeah, all that stuff. But if you're in America, you can't use it, and there's no possible way you can get around to use Hyperliquid. So from an American's perspective, do you care that they're all in Japan? Not really, right? Now, if you're in Japan, well, it's nice if they're in Japan because you get low latency, right? So you're correct that just because something is co-located doesn't mean it's bad for everyone. It could be neutral for some people and good for other people.
I think if I was in Japan, I'd prefer that the validators are run by different entities, and that the code is open source.
Yeah, but that's orthogonal to the geographic, then co-location part.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you all. Let's thank our panelists here. That was really fun. And thank you to the entire audience for staying through such a marathon day. Hopefully you learned a lot about MEV. And yeah, that's all we have, I think. Anything?
At SBC. Thank you all for participating. See you all next year, I hope.
Yeah, see you all next year. See you all next year. Hopefully not in SF or New York, but I already know it's going to be in SF, so we failed. Palo Alto. So yeah, see you there.